Welcome, everybody, to the Desi Matters podcast, where today we'll be exploring mental health within the South Asian community. Particularly poignant right now because this month is South Asian Heritage Month, and that runs from the 18th of July till the 17th of August later this month. I'm your host, Kunal Patel, and as we celebrate this year's theme, Free to Be Me, we're driving into the important conversations that often go unheard. Today, I'm joined by two incredible guests, Sandi, Kaur and Ameisha Nand from Kinesso, and together we'll navigate the unique mental health challenges faced by South Asians in the UK today, and also go through the cultural nuances that shape our experiences. Interestingly, did you know that South Asians in the UK are less likely to seek mental health support compared to the general population? In fact, a recent study revealed that only about 3% of South Asians access mental health services, highlighting a significant gap that needs to be addressed. Join us as we break the silence, share personal stories, and discuss actionable steps towards a better mental health awareness and support within our community. Welcome, Sandi, and welcome, Ameisha.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, Sandi and Ameisha, you're both at Kinesso like myself. Can you each share a personal journey that you've had with mental health and what led you to become an advocate for mental health awareness within the South Asian community?
Yeah. So for me, I would like to say I've struggled with mental health for quite a while. I lived at home until I was 18 and then moved out quite young on my own to London. And it wasn't really until I kind of started this job again and kind of had to be on my own, learn about mental health, and learn that you need to kind of take charge of it. So for me, I started on anti-anxiety medication and therapy as well, and having to kind of weave that into my kind of work life as well. My alarm for my anti-anxiety med goes off every day at 9:30. So it's not a secret that I'm taking it anymore, but it's just kind of having to deal with it at work.
And how have your colleagues been in reciprocation of that when your alarm goes off and are aware to it, alert to it? How sensitive are they to those kind of issues?
So the SEO team, they've been wonderful about it. I've had no issues from them. Me and Ameisha are on the same team.
Yeah.
I will say that at the very beginning, I try to hide it as much as I can. I would take the pill kind of underneath my desk and stuff. It looked like I was taking drugs really. When I kind of had to look back on it and kind of realize if I don't make it a big deal, no one else will, is when I started talking about it. And I talked about it so normally, everyone received it so normally. There was no issue about it. I've not been treated different in any way. And no one looks at me any different, even when that alarm goes off. It's been really good.
And over what period of time has it made you realise that you've gone from that person taking that pill under a desk to realising the issue just lies within yourself of being alert of how other people can perceive you?
It did take a while, very beginning when I first went on it. And one of the big symptoms of it is you do feel more anxiety at the beginning. So I didn't even come into the office. I just couldn't. And then I was feeling so anxious that everyone was staring at me, everyone was looking at me, especially when I'm this alarm goes off every time and I have no explanation for it. But I think over the last few months, becoming more at one with the fact that it's not a bad thing. It shouldn't be stigmatized. Some people just need a bit more help, and kind of becoming more chilled with the whole idea about it myself. Everyone else has been acting normal about it as well. So yeah, I think it took a bit of time, but because everyone was so lovely and so supportive, even if I did talk to them about it, it's become a lot easier to talk about it now than it was when I first started taking the anti-anxiety meds.
So what experiences do you have, Ameisha, with similar kind of stories as Sandi has occurred, or is your story slightly different?
It's a bit different. So I grew up in a single parent household as an only child. So kind of had a lot of over reliance on certain members of my family, and which turned into anxiety, and a lot of like panic attacks, and kind of learning how to manage that has been my focus for the past 10 years. And it's quite a hard thing to do when you have a family that doesn't really talk about things like that. And so I kind of relied more on my partner and my friends to kind of be those people that would help me through the steps to like managing my anxiety and panic attacks. Not saying that it's cured, I think cure is a very heavy word to use. I think it's more about managing and knowing what you need in those moments. So yeah, I've spent a lot of time focusing on that.
And you touched on family there, and it's probably a question for both of you. Um, South Asian culture and values and traditions are deep rooted within family. And how do you think those cultural values and traditions impact mental health and also the willingness for individuals like yourself to seek help?
I think there's a very big focus on kind of powering through, whether it's like mental health, physical like health. It's always about powering through and managing things yourself, like until it gets really bad, especially with the physical health, then you can go out and seek help. But with mental health, it's kind of like, it's not really a thing. Like it's not really seen as something that you ask for help for. You can manage it yourself. You can kind of think positively is what the words that I always get from my family. Think positively, do good, and smile all the time, and then you'll be better. Like that's kind of the thing that I always get told.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think with me as well, like in my family, it's always you can't be someone else's issue. So whatever you're going through, you've just got to deal with it yourself. Like you shouldn't make an issue for somebody else.
Yeah.
And with mental health, like you do really need a support system around you. And it's kind of difficult to reach out for your family because they're telling you constantly like, oh, you're not depressed, you're just thinking negatively.
Yeah.
And amount of times my mum has gone like, just think positive thoughts, it'll all be fine. And it's not them like trying to put you down or anything. Like that is just what they've mostly just been raised to believe.
And that is another key point. Like our families of South Asian heritage descent, they have always had the feeling of, oh, we can't bring this out in the community. What will people say is like a big thing, right? What do you think some of them common stigmas are then around mental health within the South Asian community? Because like, keep it to ourselves, or what will the community think, are like two obvious ones. But what do you think the reason holding mental health awareness in the South Asian community is? I think there's quite a few options like out there at the moment which are now openly being discussed. There's counselling, there's therapy, but from my experience, it's, oh, we can't talk about that. It's like a topic we have to put away, or what will other people think, or what will people in the family think? And it's often the parents that are giving this advice, because a lot of the time it's like, oh, we can't be seen to be like this or that way. And we have to be, no, we're the perfect family in front of everyone, where everyone's family is completely dysfunctional and behind closed doors.
Yeah, I completely agree. Like my sister got married last year, and like one of the main things I kept getting told is like, don't tell anyone that you're having issues here, or you struggle with this, and hide your tattoos, all this kind of like stuff, because they're like, people view you in a negative light, and that's going to look like we're bad parents, or you're a bad person, and that's going to affect you in this community as well, and no one's going to want to help you in the future. So I think for me, it's always been like, keep it to yourself, because we can't make the family look bad. And it goes more than just your parents. It's like, oh, our family will look bad, but then your grandma will look bad, and then your auntie, and then like your second cousin. Like that's the way they think, really.
Yeah, I've heard that before.
Yeah, I think, and for me, like, you'd think because I'm a child of divorce, it would be a bit more modern, like they'd be open to kind of the more modern concepts and things, but it's still very much hide this, hide that kind of mentality. I actually did a degree in psychology, so like for me, it's quite an important topic, to talk about. But you'd think, they'd be open to talking about it more, considering that was going to be my career at some point. But yeah, it's just very much like, no, don't talk about it. If I'm like, oh, I'm going to go to therapy, or like I've booked an appointment with like a psychologist, they'll be like, you don't need that. You can just go and like go for a walk,
Yeah.
go for a mental health walk.
You're wasting so much money.
Yeah.
They'll do no help. Just talk to us. And then you try and talk to them, and then it's like blank wall.
Yeah.
And speaking from experience, my grandparents were actually born in India, and my parents both born in East Africa. My parents, my mum was quite young when she came to the UK, and she was educated here. So she's got kind of like a mixed mindset, where my dad is like African Indian mindset. And I was obviously born here, and my daughter's born here. So we're like 2 generations born in the UK. I think with different generations, there's usually like an attitude change to mental health. Like my mum kind of has come around to it over time, because my brother, for example, he suffers with severe depression, and I grew up with him having it. And at the beginning it was, oh, we can't show this, and then she's kind of come around to like, oh, this is actually a thing we need to look into and get him help. But my grandparents, for example, they're just like, oh no, he's just sad or happy or whatever. They don't understand the different dimensions. Do you think that's because the way they were brought up? My grandparents really were poor, so they didn't really have much education. So it could be an education piece. What are your views on that?
Well, I think like when you're kind of in the situation where, for example, both my parents are born in India, but I was born here, we're in a very unusual but also kind of like lucky position in a sense. We deal with all the traditional side from home, but we're the first generation from my family anyway, like go get a proper education, go to university, get a full-time job. And while doing all those things, and then kind of like the evolution of like TikTok and social media, you're then exposed to all these elements that aren't talked about, whether it's like when my mum was being raised in India, like all this stuff wasn't being talked about. I'm being raised here, and while it's not coming from my parents or my family, I'm learning about mental health through schools, social media, and then just from friends as well. So it's kind of this mix of, they might not have grown up knowing about it, and anything that's kind of new and foreign scares them in a sense. They didn't have like all this openness around it. So it kind of trickles down like, oh, well, we didn't have it, so why do you have it?
Yeah, I think with my family it's a bit similar. Like, so I'm the first generation to be born from New Zealand. So first generation to be born in New Zealand. Everyone else has been born in Fiji. Even out of my cousins, I'm the first one to be born in New Zealand. So even though like I've got cousins that are the same age, you can still see that difference, because for the first half of their lives, they've been raised in Fiji in a more traditional kind of like setting, and it's just not been talked about. Whereas I've been exposed to like more modern kind of like, I've been to school in New Zealand, I've done my university studies there, and I've just been exposed to more concepts around like mental health. So I'm more open to talking about that. Whereas if you think like, if I talk to my cousins about it, they're like, oh, that's just dumb. I get that a lot. That's just dumb. And then like with my parents, with my mum in particular, she moved over to New Zealand when she was 17. So she's probably the most modern out of like her siblings, whereas everyone else was kind of in Fiji until they were like about 40. So she's probably more open to talking about it compared to like other family members. So it's been a bit harder to talk about it with my aunties, or like with my uncles, with my grandparents. It's a very hard conversation to bring up. So
yeah, and again, family underpins the heart of culture for Southeast Asian families, and I think family influence is quite heavy on mental health, and also the pressures of life. Like my mum would basically, when I was younger, she would basically guilt me into thinking that she's gonna like kill herself or something. Like every time, like if I didn't eat oh, you're not eating this because you want me to die, or like you're not doing your homework because you want me to jump off a cliff or whatever. So I'd get like the mental guilt trip, and it kind of like it's part of Indian, I'd say, culture, upbringing, whatever you want to call it. But sometimes that plays negatively on children in their upbringing as well. So how pivotal do you think like parents and family influence is within the South Asian communities, and those dynamics of like living in a single household or with multiple family members, like aunts, uncles living in one house? It's kind of similar, seen across like there's differences. Like I grew up with, when I was very young, there was like my uncles, aunts living with my mum and dad, and then slowly they all bought their own houses and everyone lived separately, and now no one talks to each other, which is great. But how my main question here is like, do you think those dynamics help or hinder the mental health aspect of children growing up in this country, or teenagers, or even adults?
Yeah. Oh, I know I said that we've got school and social media and stuff like that can help us, but ultimately when you're growing up, you spend the most time at home.
Yeah.
And how people react to certain things, like if they're guilting you, if they've reacted negatively to something that shouldn't be reacted negatively to, it all adds up, and that's how you're going to react to stuff as an adult, and that ultimately does affect your mental health. And if it was, done differently, for example, like if it reacted in a different way, or my parents like took a different approach to something, I may not have like maybe of the mental health issues I do now. And it's same with like the wider family, how they're acting in a certain way, if it's like through anger or happiness or sadness, it all impacts the child, because that's especially when they feel it. And then you grow up and you're still holding on to them, like those emotions as well.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to say hinder per se. I think it's a very mixed kind of dynamic. I think there's for me personally, there's some family members that will kind of are starting to kind of be more open in that conversation, but especially growing up, I think had a similar thing of like, just it's a very closed conversation, and it was like I always used to get the mom guilt of like, if I was bringing something up that was making me, giving me anxiety or something, she'd be like, "Oh, I'm only trying to be your mom. Like I'm just your mom." Like, and so then it makes you think like, "Oh, I can't actually say anything about how I feel."
Yeah. Yeah, I'd get it all the time. Like, I'm working so hard.
Yeah.
And I like understood that as well, and like I applaud my mum and dad for doing that. But it was always like, you felt bad bringing something up if it meant that they'd be upset by like as a result as well.
And especially I think when you take into consideration all the like hardships that they've gone through to get where they are. Like, I mean, we're living pretty privileged lives compared to them, right? So it's like,
I agree.
It's not as big of a deal to them because they've gone through so much worse. So then you're like, okay, well, maybe I shouldn't say something because they've gone through so much worse, so they haven't been in the same situation.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like having a kind of sacrifice and biting your tongue, because you know what the hardships they've faced, they've tried to give you a better life, and then you're basically not reacting. So then in that case, I want to switch to mental health care. And I think, like I mentioned earlier, only 3% of South Asians access mental health facilities and services in this country. What do you think some of the main barriers to that are when accessing mental health? And what do you think can be done to, one, improve access, and two, increase resource and awareness?
I think it's a question of like, where do you start? Like, because your family are less likely to talk about things like that, it's like, who do you actually reach out to help you get to those resources? I think now with social media, it's made it a lot easier because there's like a lot more conversations around it, especially like in Brown Girl TikTok, like there's a lot more around it, so you can find those resources. But I think, it's I don't know, I'm blanking now. Sorry.
No, I agree that it's like, where do you begin? Because I think for most people, if they grow up, they've always been told, like, if you're struggling with this, go to this person or this person.
Yeah.
Where there's like, when you're growing up in kind of a very traditional Asian household, you don't get told where to go. So when it came from, for example, me, I had no idea where to start. Like, I've heard of therapy, I've heard of this, but where do I go? What do I need? And it takes you a while to figure that out as well. And then on top of that, trying to find someone that you can talk to that's going to understand you, because I think being like South Asian, but then also growing up in a Western country, it's a very unique experience. So sometimes you'll have stories that someone that isn't like South Asian, they may not understand, and you need to kind of find that balance of relating to somebody as well.
I think, coming back to our conversation, it is always difficult because we can't always find that person relatable to our own experiences, because there's such a massive divide with those of South Asian background that openly talk about what the challenges that they've been through. Sometimes when you call some of those helplines, you've got someone who's got nothing as a background that's relatable to you as the experiences you've gone through. And sometimes you're just talking to this person and they don't really relate, or you can't really have a proper conversation with them. So I think people like yourselves becoming advocates of mental health awareness in the UK is a great start, but I think more can be also done. I've seen recently on TikTok and on LinkedIn, there's quite a lot of people talking about mental health, especially now that it's South Asian Heritage Month. Last week we had Sangeeta Pillai come in, talk about advocacy for women, and she dealt with a lot of mental health, and it was quite interesting to hear her talk. But we need more people like that available, talking, and just being more prominent, so that people know there's someone always out there to talk to them about the issues that they're going through.
Yeah, completely agree.
So I think in that regard, when we talk about having more role models, there should also be a more greater role played on the community support part. Yeah. And I think community support, especially if you live actually anywhere in the UK, you could live in areas that are predominantly Asian. You could live in areas like where I live in Canterbury, there's hardly any Asians. But you need someone in the community or a group of people. I think Facebook, to an extent, has created kind of those groups. I don't trust them that much anymore because of questionable content on there. But I think community support plays a massive part, especially within the South Asian community. And community leaders and organisations should be able to contribute. Have you reached out to any community leaders or organisations as part of your mental health efforts, Ameisha?
I actually have not. I think I found it quite hard, especially moving over here, to find those resources and find someone that is actually talking about that within like the South Asian community. But in saying that, being on TikTok and Instagram, seeing a lot of influencers talking more about like things like if you're having kind of a bad day, getting outside and just taking that first step of like doing something active has helped. It's like almost like the gateway, I think, to get to that big step of like obviously talking to therapists or talking more about mental health. But I think those influences have helped me a lot in figuring out what to do.
Yeah, I totally agree with the influencer stuff. Like, the only reason I became so comfortable talking about my mental health is because I saw so many of the same influencers from the same background talking about it. And it really helps with, I think, people in kind of our generation that are like chronically online, and they're seeing that so often. And I think the only kind of like issue comes is when you've got the generation above you, and then if they not necessarily have influencers, but you know, you've got community leaders within your own community or your temple, if they were to talk
Yeah.
about it, sometimes they are like, the generation above us is just more receptive to them than they are to us. Because what I get a lot is like, you're so young, you haven't experienced
Yeah.
life. Like, once you get to my age, you'll understand.
Yeah.
But if it was, for example, somebody at the temple talking to them, I know for a fact that they would believe them straight away.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I do a lot of temple work, which we call sewa, when you go to the temple and you basically help out, because the temple, as you're aware, they don't pay anyone. Everyone that goes there does sewa, which basically means helping, and we help out. And there have been organisations that come in and talk about these kind of issues: mental health, depression, anxiety, and other organisations that come in to basically spread awareness. Because I find that when you go to the temple, it's kind of a close knit and
Yeah.
like boxed in vision kind of viewpoint, and they don't know anyone outside their circle, and it's usually the older generation. I'm talking my grandparents' generation and probably my dad's generation getting there now because he's almost 80. Going there, where they literally have their friend circle, they'll go to a temple, they'll help out, they'll cook, and then they'll just help out clean and just make it organised. And it's less and less more of the younger generation. But I think if such things were available in the temple, rather than, oh, we're going to the temple to pray, or they're going to celebrate something, or there's a wedding or whatever, do you think more of the South Asian community would attend like those kind of community, they're kind of religious centres and now community centres as well now?
Yeah,
I think
100%.
definitely, yeah. I think it would make it definitely a more open space.
Yeah.
And a more like safe space to talk about things like this. So I would definitely go a lot more if that was available.
Yeah, like I pray in a Gurdwara, and I love to go to Gurdwara. I find a lot of peace there. But if, people were more receptive to like talking about mental health and not feeling like you're being scrutinized when you're going, and not having all these kind of invasive questions like, why aren't you married? Why aren't you living at home? What's that thing like tattooed on you?
Yeah.
If there was kind of this more kind of openness community, I would think like a lot more younger people in the South Asian community would be so happy to go, because a lot of us do love like going to pray, and like I love going to the Gurdwara. It is just kind of that fear of being like scrutinized, which causes anxiety, which causes you not to go.
Yeah, I think my preference is obviously I'm not from here, so I usually just pray at home. I think, especially when I was back home, going to the temple, it was very much a like dreading experience a little bit. It was like, oh, what are they going to say about me? Like, what's the thing that they're going to judge me on? Like, if I'm not like as energetic as I normally am, or if I'm not like talking as much as I usually am, it's like, oh, what's wrong? And it's like, you can't actually talk about what's wrong.
So you both mentioned they, and for the purpose of people listening, they are Indian aunties.
Literally.
Yeah.
And sometimes uncles.
Yeah.
But mainly aunties. And that basically refers to, they don't even have to be related to you.
No.
Yeah,
They're
everyone's an
usually
auntie.
not related. They're just any uncle or auntie that are older than you, because we don't call people by their first name in our culture.
Yeah, I think with the aunties and uncles as well, like, you don't want to say anything negative to them, because you don't want to be the person that, like, they'll go around saying, oh, well, his daughter or her daughter said something, like, bad about this.
And
gossip
then it's
spreads.
Chinese whispers
Yeah.
with Indian aunties and uncles.
Like, gossip spreads so quickly.
Yeah.
You could say that cat is black, and by the time it goes all the way around, it will come back and say, he said that's a dog.
Literally.
Yeah.
It makes sense, yeah.
Great. Can you share an experience where cultural understanding made a significant difference in your mental health journey? So, like, when we talk about the family, I think, where did someone in your family understand the journey that you were going on?
I think for me, it was more with my siblings. So we didn't, grow up being very close. We're very close now, but I think we've gotten over ourselves and we're not as dramatic anymore.
Yeah.
But when I was like opening up to them about like, I find this difficult, and because of how mum and dad acted like this way, now I find this difficult. Once they started understanding it and then kind of understood why I react the way I do to some things, it made us a lot closer. But then also like I could understand them as well. You know, sometimes we get so caught up, we think we literally are just the main character, but your siblings and your friends are also going through similar things. So I think that's when I was like, okay, now we can find some common ground.
Yeah, I think for me, my mom actually is the big one. Obviously, growing up, it was not a big thing to talk to her about. But now that I'm older, I'm almost 30, talking to her more widely about like mental health and like how I actually am impacted by like, you know, anxiety, panic attacks, and having multiple conversations around it has helped. I know that in the beginning, she was just kind of like, what are you talking about? Like, why are you talking to me about this? But now she's more like, if I bring something up, she'll be like, okay, you're kind of starting to understand what's going on. So it has made it a lot easier. I think it's all about like having multiple conversations with your family members, maybe starting with someone that you think is going to understand it more. I actually started with my cousins that have been educated in New Zealand for like maybe the last 10 years. So they kind of more open to those ideas. Maybe when they're younger, not so much, but now that they're like in their 20s, it's a lot easier to talk to them. So, yeah.
And what advice, so you mentioned a key piece of advice there, but what advice crucially would you give someone watching today about how they could go about discovering the mental health benefits of talking to others, some of the options and support out there? What advice generally would you give to the people watching?
I think if you don't know where to start, I think looking online is a very good way of figuring out, kind of taking those little steps. Like for me personally, I think starting with self-care was a big thing. It made me realize, hey, actually these things that I'm doing actually make me feel good. They're making me less anxious in certain situations. And it's like learning about what works for you. And then using that to maybe talk to someone professionally, maybe starting to talk to people around you in your community, whether it's like friends or family, is a good way to kind of open up the dialogue around it. You may notice that there's someone around you that's maybe going through the same thing, but they never actually mentioned it.
Yeah.
So if you're kind of talking to them about like, hey, this is what I've started to try, maybe we could talk about it a bit more.
Yeah, totally agree. And I think for me, it's like, you know, always take the first step at your own pace.
Yeah.
So for me, it was like dealing with my mental health on my own and at my own pace and, you know, going through my own resources. And when you're feeling comfortable enough that you decide to share it, you know, share it at your own pace as well. But definitely talking to people around you is a good step. And it's usually like, you know, your friends, your peers, or like even people on like TikTok and stuff, everyone's gone through somewhat of a similar experience. So you kind of realize like you're, as cheesy as it sounds, like you're not alone in this.
Yeah.
Like there are, you know, thousands of people out there.
So when we spoke earlier, before we started, we talked about role models, and you both basically said you don't have one. Yeah. You're kind of your own role model, which I really appreciate. But who are some of the people, and you may not have any, that have positively influenced your perspective around mental health with your journeys?
I would literally just say, like, I'm on this like subsection of TikTok called Desi TikTok or Brown Girl TikTok. And honestly, like just the influences there, even if they're not specifically talking about mental health, they'll sometimes be talking about, you know, this makeup brand is really good, or this is what you should do with your makeup and it suits your skin. Like just those girls that have like put themselves out on the internet, but have like made the fact that, you know, not being ashamed of the fact that they're being a brown girl and being so open about it has made me like more comfortable with it. And then as a result, you find more influencers who kind of like look like you, have got a similar experience to you, and they're talking about their mental health. And I would say like anyone that's brave enough to go on the internet and to talk about it so openly, they would definitely be considered a role model.
Yeah, and I think that's definitely played a big part for me. But also I think just even with people around you, like even at work or in social settings, there are a lot of, in my circle particularly, there's a lot of brown women around me, and just drawing from them, even though they're close friends, but just talking to them about it and like seeing what they're going through has helped, because you know you're not alone, you know.
Yeah, and that is a key message. No one's alone. There's so many resources out there. People may not be aware, but hopefully things like this, where we have discussions and talk openly, sometimes it's always just your friends and family that are your first port of call, because you never know. Like you could be living with, you know, a sibling that may have experienced it. They might be older than you, and they might have techniques or ways of going about it where they necessarily not had anyone, or a cousin or a parent, you know, at the end of the day. Like, for example, my mum came from East Africa, a very traumatic experience because they were kicked out of Uganda overnight by Idi Amin, and she was just a child. So coming from like East Africa, where it was like, she used to tell me we saw lions and elephants and giraffes and all of that, and then coming to the UK, traumatic experience for a child to come into the UK, and then and she actually, once my brother talked about his depression, she actually said she was severely depressed in secondary school when she first came, because she talked English, but she didn't really speak UK English. She spoke African English, well, East African English. She's slightly different with an accent. So, you know, it's only when other family members, I think it's worth exploring those avenues, because people open up when a lot of people trust their own people, be that community or family. So that's an avenue I found myself through personal experiences that helps. But I have a question for both of you, and that is, how, when we talk about the community, how can members of the community get involved to support mental health initiatives within the South Asian community? We talked about the temple and the Gurdwara, but aside from that, we have community centres, but then like we have loads of events. Like, for example, our Glastonbury is like Melas, right? And they're held throughout the country. So one of my things that I thought about is, why don't they have, and they might do, but I've just never seen it, why don't they have a dedicated thing on, like, at the Melas, which is like basically an Asian music festival, and they have loads of nice food. It's worth going if you haven't been. Why don't they have dedicated like mental health champions there, or booths talking about issues? And I think it's down to image, reputation. No one wants to be seen in about 20,000 people as the ones going to talk about their mental health.
Yeah, but I think, like, you know, at these events, if the more normal they treat it, the more normal everyone else is going to treat it. So if they just make themselves known, and if they just put themselves in that position where they're like, okay, we're talking about mental health, more and more people would hopefully become receptive to it. But I completely understand the thing about image, where it's like, nobody wants to be the center of gossip. But I think the more and more, especially with like our generation, we treat it as like a topic that should be openly discussed. Hopefully, like more and more people just like treat it as a normal-ish topic that we can talk about, and this kind of idea of image will slowly fade out.
Yeah, and I think to add to that, I think starting in your day-to-day community is a good way to kind of look at it, as if you find that like big events are quite a daunting place to start with, start in a smaller place. So start in like, maybe there's a pocket of like people that have gone through the same thing, or that you think might be more open to talking about it. If you start there and say, hey, let's talk about this more, maybe we can eventually go out and actually do it at those big events. Or if you're in, for example, like when I was younger, I did a lot of like Indian dancing, so with my friends. Back then it wasn't really a thing to talk about, but now that like my generation is starting to lead those classes, if you're leading like something like that, talking to the kids that you teach or the groups that you teach a bit more about mental health is a good way to kind of get more conversation around it.
I completely agree. One final point, we're going to be wrapping up soon. So I just wanted to understand, if you had one piece of advice to our community, our leaders within the community, place of worship, family, friends, anyone, who would it be to, and why, and what would it be?
I guess it would just be to, for me anyway, you know, the generation above us, and I would just say, just listen, you know, to people. We're not saying these things to try and like gain attention. We want to have these conversations, and we want to be so open, and we want to share our experiences. So listening to us, we want to listen back, and we want your help.
Yeah.
Everyone will be receptive, but it is just make it a safe and open space.
Yeah, and I think with that is like it's a conversation. So I think there's a lot around like just being dismissive of people's feelings when you talk about like mental health.
Yeah.
And it's just about maybe don't make that your first reaction. Maybe just sit there and listen first, and then think about how to react before you do the reaction is a big thing.
Yeah, I completely agree. So I've learned a huge amount, and thank you, Ameisha, and thank you, Sandi, for being part of Open Heritage Network's podcast for South Asian Heritage Month. Hopefully our viewers have learned a lot about mental health within the South Asian community. I'm Kunal Patel, and thank you.